Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Sarah Zenaida Gould, and I'm the Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. Tonight, I'm very pleased to be here with Mikaela Selley. She is an archivist and curator based in Houston, Texas, where she has a long record of working with and in community to preserve Mexican American history. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes. So tonight you're here to tell us about a project that you recently worked on, which documents President John F. Kennedy's visit to LULAC in Houston in 1963. So I'm going to just turn it over to you and have you tell us more about that.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, as you mentioned, I'm an archivist and a public historian and a consultant for cultural heritage projects. And one of the things that I absolutely love to do is bring archival records to life through exhibit design. So I'm really excited to talk about this current exhibition. I'm going to go ahead and share the slide. Okay, so tonight I'm talking about the current exhibition, A Civil Rights Milestone, President Kennedy's Visit with LULAC in Houston. And this is the 60th anniversary. So a quick thank you to those that made this exhibit possible. The exhibit was commissioned by C60 Inc., which is the organization working to restore the historic LULAC Clubhouse here in Houston, as well as the Historic LULAC Council 60 and the Heritage Society. And of course, a huge thank you to all of the sponsors and supporters that helped make this exhibit possible. So this exhibit commemorates the 60th anniversary of President Kennedy's visit to Houston. On November 21st, 1963, for 17 defining minutes, President John F. Kennedy, First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson, and Second Lady, Lady Bird Johnson, attended a reception at the Rice Hotel sponsored by the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC. That night is widely recognized as the first time a U.S. president acknowledged Latinos as a significant voting bloc. Now, it's important to note, this is not to say that this was the first time this community was civically or politically engaged, not at all, and we'll talk about that later. But this was the first time that a sitting president recognized this community in such a grand way. The president addressed a very enthusiastic crowd that evening, and the First Lady graciously spoke in Spanish. As you can see in the photograph, mariachis were there. They serenaded the presidential party. They wrote a special song, Jacqueline, Jacqueline, just for that evening. And San Antonio's very own Henry B. Gonzalez was in attendance that evening, and in fact was an invited guest speaker for that night. Of course, having only 2 years prior become the first Mexican American to represent Texas in the United States Congress. In fact, guests from LULAC councils all over the state of Texas were there that night here in Houston. I don't know how many were from San Antonio, but I'd be really curious to know that number. If you can imagine, it was an evening that validated and inspired guests to this very day. The room was full of hope and promise. This was 1963, so this was against the backdrop of the civil rights movement. And as we'll talk about later, 3 decades of LULAC activism before this 1963 historic moment. And as we know, 15 hours later, after this historic visit, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. So he spent his last night with Mexican American activists. And so those 17 minutes live on as a key civil rights milestone, and that's what this exhibit is all about. So how did LULAC get the president to come to the Rice Hotel in Houston on that evening? It was known that President Kennedy would be making a trip to Texas, and that he would be speaking at a dinner for Texas Congressman Albert Thomas in Houston. So LULAC, there was a lot of strategy behind this. This was not a lucky break. LULAC was very strategic and decided to host an event to honor their state director. But they chose to host the event at the Rice Hotel, knowing that this was the hotel that the president would most likely be staying in, given the area, the proximity to where the Albert Thomas dinner was being held. And so they sent a letter to the president, and they made sure to mention a few key points to get his attention. They pointed out that Mexican Americans had helped him win 3 years earlier in 1960, when they created the Viva Kennedy campaigns, and that LULAC members from all over the giant state of Texas would be in attendance. So they were really promoting the fact that this was an opportunity for the president to speak to this community who had previously helped him win, and that there would be membership from all across the state. The LULAC invitation, as you can imagine, was one of thousands that the president received. And the response from Secret Service was that this was a long shot. It was a huge maybe. 2 weeks prior to November 21st, a Secret Service agent met with 2 LULAC members, Alex Arroyos and Mike Herrera, and said that at the very most, President Kennedy would make his way down the elevator, wave to the crowd, and then depart on his way to the Albert Thomas dinner. And LULAC was instructed not to go to the press. They were not to share this information with anyone. Of course, through word of mouth and telephone calls, word got out that the president might show up, and hundreds and hundreds of LULAC members from across the state traveled to Houston that evening on the hope that maybe they might see him wave from the elevator. So LULAC set up the space to accommodate the best case scenario, right? So they placed 4 chairs in front of the stage where the mariachis would be. They brought an autograph book for signatures. And if you can imagine the moment that the elevator door opened, and instead of waving, President of the United States, the First Lady, LBJ, Lady Bird Johnson, walk out of the elevator, make their way across the room, and sit in front of the mariachis. They address the crowd. The oral histories from people who were there describe just this incredibly electrifying and exciting moment. And so the exhibit walks you through these moments, from the invitation to that evening, and of course through to the tragic next day. And in addition to commemorating the 60th anniversary of that evening, the exhibit also highlights a few other themes. When you visit, you'll see a section dedicated to Jacqueline Kennedy and her choice to speak Spanish that evening. It was incredibly, I think, moving for people. And as we know, LULAC members could easily flow between English and Spanish. She did not have to speak Spanish to this crowd, but she chose to speak in that language, and it was recognized as a sign of respect for culture and community. And so the exhibit absolutely highlights that fact. There's also room in the exhibit that talks about LULAC's history of activism leading up to that moment, as well as the history of the historic clubhouse at 3004 Bagby Street in Houston, Texas. So as you make plans to visit the exhibit, I really want to point out a few other special features. So this is the first bilingual exhibit at this museum in Houston, at the Heritage Society Museum. The exhibit also offers several sort of, I'd call activity stations, interactive stations. You can either, read something, watch something. There's a touchscreen monitor with a LULAC timeline. There are copies of the historic LULAC newspapers and film footage from the November 21st, 1963 evening, where you can watch Jacqueline Kennedy give her speech in Spanish. I really wanted to incorporate these different sort of interactive moments to appeal to all ages. So I encourage youth to attend, bring your kids. And I really wanted to include printed copies of the LULAC newspaper. One, for those who are familiar with what it's like to read a newspaper and what it feels like, what it smells like to read a newspaper. Printed out. And then for the younger generation who doesn't know what that's like. So we've recreated these sort of little living rooms that give a 1960s era feel to offer that sort of experience. There are also 3 archival institutions represented in this exhibit. So there's material from the John F. Kennedy Library and Museum in Boston. There's material from the Recovering the U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage Archive at Arte Publico Press here in Houston, and from the Houston History Research Center at the Houston Public Library. There are also a few very special items on display. On the screen now is a partial copy of a manuscript titled "They Have Killed My President," Han matado a mi presidente, and this was written by civil rights attorney John J. Herrera. He was the master of ceremonies that evening, and he's the one who wrote the invitation to the president. And his entire manuscript is enlarged on the wall so that you can read. And what he does is he describes in detail everything from the invitation to the tragedy the next day. And it's a really moving and powerful narrative. And you're able to put yourself in his shoes as he describes what happened. There's also a small tribute to Providencia Paredes. Providencia was born in the Dominican Republic in the 1920s, and she was an assistant to the First Lady at this time. And she's believed to be the first Latina to work in the White House inner circle. And I learned more about her when trying to understand Jackie Kennedy's Spanish proficiency and how she came to make the decision to speak Spanish. I was familiar with her, speaking different languages and everywhere that she went, but I wanted to kind of dive in more. And I found reference to her practicing her Spanish with her assistant who went by Provi. And so there's a small portion of the exhibit that talks about Providencia. And I wanted to just highlight this particular photo. This is of 6 Latino officers of the Houston Police Department who were selected to guard the president that evening. And it's just an interesting piece of history, a great photo that talks about these sort of, background people that evening and their role in that historic night. So I want to talk about the significance of the 60th anniversary. Beyond being a presidential visit, what did this mean for Mexican-American civil rights history? And so to understand this, we have to think about, well, who is LULAC, right? Who is the League of United Latin American Citizens? What were they experiencing at this time? What had they worked towards leading up to this moment? And what was happening in Houston? So LULAC had been involved in major civil rights efforts in the 3 decades prior to this 1963 historic event. So I'm going to run through just a few of these. And these are all images from a LULAC timeline that was created by Arte Publico Press in collaboration with LULAC. So this is completely available in English and in Spanish on the Arte Publico Press website. We will be adding a link in the chat. so that you can access this. But these are just screenshots from pieces of that timeline. It's an incredible historical reference. So LULAC was founded in 1929 in Corpus Christi, and so as early as the 1930s, we see the organization working towards desegregating public places throughout Texas, from public bathrooms to restaurants to barbershops to hotels. And we also see an effort to a movement against the creation of segregated Mexican schools in Texas. For example, this case in Del Rio, this was a first class action lawsuit against these Mexican schools, and LULAC provided the funding, sort of the financial base and the organization behind this effort. In the 1940s, we see LULAC playing a significant role in filing discrimination cases for the Federal Employment Practices Commission. And we also see LULAC making headlines when they defend veterans who are continuously being discriminated against, even in uniform and even after going through World War II. And in this particular instance, this was veteran MACRI Garcia. He was refused service in Sugar Land, Texas, and LULAC funded his legal defense when he was arrested at the restaurant. And this made national headlines. As LULAC was expanding beyond Texas, there were councils popping up all over the country. We see desegregation efforts in places like California. This example is a Mendez versus Westminster lawsuit to end segregation in California's public schools. And it became a key precedent for Brown versus Board of Education. And we also see in the 1940s, LULAC helping to found the American GI Forum, once again, working towards addressing the discriminatory issues against veterans. And in the 1950s, we see LULAC attorneys take on the Hernandez versus the state of Texas. So this was a lawsuit that made its way to the US Supreme Court and won the right for Mexican Americans to serve on juries. And in Houston, in 1957, we see Council 60 piloting an education project called the Little School of 400. LULAC Council 60 was at the center of Mexican-American political organizing in Houston, especially during the 50s and 60s. And this was one of the most significant programs to come out of that council. Felix Tijerina, who was from Houston and national president and chairman of LULAC's educational fund at the time, established this program. And the idea was to teach 400 basic English words to Spanish-speaking children. And this ended up becoming the formula for Project Head Start. So it expanded from the local to the national level as part of President LBJ's war on poverty later. So by the time of John F. Kennedy's presidential campaign in 1960, we clearly see that LULAC had spent over 3 decades fighting against segregation and discrimination. And these are just this is a very quick run through just a few moments on this timeline, all while encouraging Mexican Americans to participate in the political process. And yet, despite these accomplishments, there was this feeling that there seemed to be little room for discussion of the Mexican American or Latino experience when it comes to race in this country. So the 1960 election offered the chance to influence national politics. LULAC joined the effort to form Viva Kennedy clubs. and these were independent state Democratic Party committees. The Viva Kennedy clubs absolutely promoted the consolidation of the Latino vote and helped Kennedy win in 1960. In fact, he received 85% of the Mexican-American vote to win that election. So going back to this invitation sent by John J. Herrera in Houston, this was an attempt to revitalize the Viva Kennedy Club movement, remind the president and the White House of those efforts. And out of this movement, we'll see the formation of PASO, the Political Association of Spanish-Speaking Organizations, that would go on to continue to be civically and politically engaged. And so there is so much more to dive into. So for anyone interested in learning more about LULAC or about more of the archival records related to November 21st, 1963, I've got a few books on the slide. These are works by Dr. Cynthia Orozco, Dr. Tom Krennick, focusing on particular LULAC membership and LULAC activism. There's also a great website, jfklulac.com. This has a curated list of resources about President Kennedy's visit to Houston, courtesy of one LULAC member, a local LULAC member, David Contreras, here in Houston. And a lot of the archival documents on display come from the Houston History Research Center, specifically the John J. Herrera papers. There are photographs from the Alex Arroyo's collection that are on display from that evening, as well as oral histories. There was an oral history project done 10 years ago at the 50th anniversary, and that's where those impactful and powerful statements and testimonies about that evening, and those really help fill in the gap that the archival records leave, and they just really tell of such an incredible evening, and of course how sad it was to feel the impact of that moment that night, and then to learn of the tragic death the next day, and how everyone took that and what that meant for the organization. There's a letter in the exhibit that expresses, the sorrow at the news, but also the very clear path forward to continue working with LBJ. And so it's a really interesting few items on the exhibit wall that talks about the tragedy the next day. So once again, this exhibit is at the Heritage Society Museum. It is up through January 15th. You can get more information about the exhibit at the Heritage Society website, heritagesociety.org/Kennedy-LULAC. And in commemoration of the anniversary next Tuesday on November 21st, there is free entry to the museum. Normally, it's a $5 entry fee, but on Tuesday, it'll be free. We're also putting in the chat a link to a promotional video that shows a little bit more of the museum, what to expect when you arrive, other things that you can see. So please take a look at that when you get a chance. And I just want to say thank you so much, and I'm really eager to answer any questions that you have about the exhibit, about the design process, and about this history.
Thank you so much, Mika. That's just fascinating. And I just say you were talking about the, all of the research elements that you put into it, and then also how you layered in different experiences for different types of visitors. I love that. Really, you were thinking about intergenerational visitors and how would somebody experience the exhibit if they have memories of this, if they actually have, experience holding and smelling newspapers versus not. I love that. That's great. I think so often what we do see with, like family outings to things like this is you do get people with different generations in their little group that go. So that's really thoughtful.
Thank you. I really enjoyed thinking of those details.
Yeah. I also wanted to ask, I think that one of the things that's so fascinating is how you connected the JFK visit to this dinner with other things that LULAC had been working on, right? That this was very strategic, that they were trying to fill in what they felt was a gap. So maybe you could just say a tiny bit more about the Viva Kennedy and what that was and why they were wanting to revive energy behind that.
Yes. So the in the exhibit, you'll notice there's Viva Kennedy correspondence. So letterhead with Viva Kennedy written on it. You'll see campaign buttons. So this was very much a campaign effort to elect President Kennedy, and then the idea to revitalize that was to bring people together to understand that President Kennedy was, in many people's minds, the answer to a lot of more movement forward for the activism that already was happening. So a lot of these programs that were taking place, if LBJ hadn't moved them forward, like the Little School of 400, the thought was that Kennedy was going to be the president that would help them move forward. In fact, one of the oral histories, I think it was with Alex Arroyos, he talks about how the next step after this night was to then ask for a meeting in Washington, D.C. for all of the leaders in LULAC. That was already on their minds. They left that evening saying, okay, we're going to revitalize the Viva Kennedy movement, and we're going to set up a major meeting in Washington, D.C. These are the steps. So there was already movement in progress to take this beyond the 17 minutes at the Rice Hotel. And of course, that didn't happen.
You know what, this really it makes me think about how there was so much hope from Latinos in general, but certainly Mexican Americans, that electing JFK was going to mean that he would see us as a voting bloc, as you've described, and that he would recognize the challenges Mexican Americans were facing in terms of being recognized for voting rights, in terms of being recognized for school equality, health equality, labor equality, all of these civil rights issues facing Mexican Americans. And at this time, we see a lot of movement happening within the African American civil rights movement. And so we've kind of pinned some hopes on JFK. And then, of course, he is assassinated. Fast forward a few years later, Martin Luther King Jr. has evolved his work into this Poor People's Campaign, this Poor People's Movement, which is very all-inclusive, including a number of Mexican Americans, people even at that point, sort of early Chicanos, planning to organize in Washington, D.C. around a shared interest around we're all united by challenges of being impoverished. And then, of course, MLK is assassinated and that movement kind of peters out. That opportunity for working together or to have Mexican Americans and other Latinos recognized a little bit more at the national scale. And I don't know, I'm thinking about what could have been with JFK. It also just calls to mind what could have been with MLK and the Poor People's Campaign. We have Dr. Orozco watching online. You mentioned, yes, you mentioned Dr. Orozco. She would like for you to say a little bit more about the interviews with the LULAC members
Yeah, absolutely. So 10 years ago, for the 50th anniversary, I worked with LULAC Council 60 and several other councils, and it was more of a pop-up exhibit at the Rice Hotel. But we also did an oral history project that evening. And there were several people there who had been there in 1963, and we had, I believe, 8 people come by and share their memories. And all of them are very moving. And but what's interesting is like I mentioned, how so many of them fill in the gaps that we didn't know about. So, for example, Alex Arroyos, whose many of his photographs are on display in the exhibit, talks about going to work the next day and hearing the news and asking his boss to leave because he's so overwhelmed. And then he thinks to himself, I don't have any photos from that night. So he runs over to the Houston Chronicle. And if you can imagine, the room is chaos, right? Reporters are running around, and he finds somebody and he asks, can I have photos from last night? They run off, they come back with a stack of photos, they hand it to him, and they say, yes, you can take them. And in awe of this fortune to have these photographs from the Houston Chronicle, he then runs to the Houston Post, gets in his car and goes to the Houston Press. And in less than 24 hours from that evening, he acquires this incredible collection of photographs taken by all 3 local newspapers from that evening. And then he would go on to hold on to these for quite some time before donating copies to the Houston Public Library. And, he had kept them together. He lovingly, put them in a scrapbook and shared them with us. And beyond that story, he's the one who spoke with the Secret Service, and so he expands on those conversations, and he fills in all of those gaps that exist. The interview with Mike Herrera, all of these years, I've always known that John Herrera wrote the invitation to the president, but in the interview with Mike, he gives a detail that says that the letter was actually typed by Tina Adame. And here we see more of that women's roles in LULAC, and where were they as part of this evening in planning it. And so I was so excited to add that detail to the caption for the first time in the exhibit to say, yes, John J. Herrera dictated the letter, but Tina Adame was there, an active LULAC member, typing the letter, making sure that it made its way to Washington, D.C. So, and then the granddaughter, there were no children allowed at this event, and yet in the photographs we see 2 little girls who are just hanging out with Jackie. They make their way near her, and one of them is the granddaughter of John J. Herrera, and she gives an interview, and she's 4 years old at the time. She remembers nothing about that night except that her mother made the skirt she was wearing just for the occasion. It was a big deal. And I'm so happy to say the family shared that skirt with us. It is on display in the exhibit next to a photo of her wearing it next to Jacqueline Kennedy. And it's such a beautiful little thing, but it's so, it just speaks to how much pride, went into that evening. And of course, the family has kept it intact all these years. And she talks about, even though she doesn't remember anything that night, she remembers the next day, and just it had such a powerful impact on her as a little girl. And she says it was the first moment of sadness she had ever experienced in her life, this like deep sadness, and witnessing her mother cry, witnessing the family's reaction. And so it's really exciting to have pieces like that in the exhibit to share with people, and I think those kinds of items will really resonate with people.
Yeah. We have another comment in here from David Contreras, a LULAC historian, wants to know about a guest book.
Yes. So as I mentioned, a lot of planning went into this evening, and Council I think 368, brought an autograph book for that night. And all four of the presidential parties signed it. President Kennedy signed it, Jacqueline Kennedy, LBJ, Lady Bird Johnson, I believe possibly other VIP guests, possibly Henry B. Gonzalez, I cannot remember at the moment. And that autograph book has been lost to time. Alex Arroyos has a photocopy of the signatures, which is an incredible addition to the exhibit as well. But I don't know if this is true. I don't know if it's one of the last signatures from President Kennedy. I don't know if he signed anything between that moment and noon the next day. But it's out there somewhere, and yeah, we're hopeful that this brings attention to those kinds of artifacts that may be around in people's homes. If anybody has more items, I encourage you to share with archives or learn about preserving them. In fact, a lot of the memorabilia on display is from personal collections. So beyond archives, we have incredible, campaign buttons and JFK albums, Rice Hotel memorabilia from several families. So the Asif family, Contreras family, McKinney, Henry Lasso, several local families who decided to share their artifacts for the exhibit. And for that, I'm very grateful.
Could you tell a little bit more about how the exhibit came to be and, how it ended up at the Houston Heritage Society?
Sure. So LULAC Council 60 and the Clubhouse organization wanted to commemorate the 60th anniversary. We had worked together 10 years ago, and the Heritage Society offered their space to us. And so it was really exciting to have an entire museum space to dedicate to telling this story. And the initial idea from the jump was to highlight that night, but also pull at those other threads that come off of that evening, right? So Jackie Kennedy, her choice to speak Spanish, because 10 years ago, we really focused more on John F. Kennedy. And so we wanted to take a look at Jackie. She's the first lady that started the White House Historical Association. So not only a love for language and culture, but an interest in historic preservation. So we thought her story was a really interesting to include in the exhibit, while also bringing attention to the clubhouse restoration efforts here in Houston. And so the idea, I wanted to have people sort of literally walk through the events of that evening. So you'll notice a wall that says the invitation, and then a wall that says November 21st, and then a wall that says the next day. So you're literally walking through how it started and how it ended. And then the different sections behind that offer the chance to watch the film footage, to sit in a vintage chair and hold the LULAC newspaper, and then a section dedicated to Jackie Kennedy and the news clippings that focus on her side of the story.
Yeah, got it. Well, that's just fantastic. So, everybody who's watching, if you're going to Houston for the holidays, or you have family coming into Houston for the holidays, check out this exhibit at the Houston Heritage Society that's there through January 15th, and it's free next Tuesday, right?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Mika, could you, just before we let you go, could you talk a little bit more about, you and I know each other, but you're a public historian working in Houston, and you've done a number of interesting projects over the years to highlight Mexican American history. Could you just maybe talk a little bit about your work?
Sure. I am an archivist. I trained in public history, and I spent 8 years as the city archivist in Houston for the Hispanic collections. And it's through that role that I really was able to network and learn about all of the different efforts happening locally. It's how I was able to meet so many families and so many organizations. It's how I met LULAC members, and really learned again of these different, the incredible dissertation projects, documentary films happening, artists creating murals. And so from there, sort of building that network and understanding all of the different either historical preservation efforts or public history projects happening, I have been able to continue those connections through my consulting work in aiding in those projects. So I've done research projects for example, faculty needing photographs from Houston collections, both personal collections and archives. There is nothing more enjoyable than digging into the records and looking for those gems and hoping they make it on the cover of a book.
Mhm.
And then LULAC and sort of advocates of historical preservation, like people like David Contreras, have absolutely pointed me in the direction of, here's a family who's looking for assistance in preserving their records. Here's an effort. For example, there was a community center, and they commissioned a historical timeline to talk about a particular family that has decades of history with that community center. And so that was part design work, part research. And then I've helped with, basic archival processing as well. And so I wear multiple hats in this role, and all of them revolve around either bringing attention to archival records through design work, or working to preserve them or arrange them. And I've been very fortunate. There's so much work being done in Houston, so many projects, so many people doing the work. And I've been very fortunate to be invited to help in some way or another in all of these different projects. My current role at Arte Publico Press, another local repository, a local archive, has been incredible as well. They are collecting from local Hispanic families, and they do a lot of digital humanities work. And so I'm learning even more about how to share these archives in that way, through mapping projects and timelines, like the LULAC timeline, and so I've been very fortunate here in Houston to do this work and to work with a lot of incredible people who are also passionate.
Well, thank you. And you mentioned murals, and Dr. Orozco came back with another question. She
Oh,
wants to know more about this mural at the Heritage Society by Jessie Cifuentes.
yes. So when you visit the exhibit in Houston,
Mhm.
right outside is an incredible mural by two artists, Jessie Cifuentes and Laura Lopez Cano, who it's a mural. It's such an incredible teaching tool because it's got all of these figures and in important places in Houston's Latino history. I remember when I was working at the archive at the Houston Public Library, I remember them coming in and doing the research. And so there's, it talks about, or it features images of the railroad workers, of restaurant history, people like Ninfa Lorenzo, and the Tex-Mex food history in Houston. It features our political history with several leaders in Houston, local leaders. And it includes an image of Jackie and John F. Kennedy as well as a milestone. So it's a huge mural right outside the wall of the museum that really walks you through early 1900s Houston Hispanic history. It's beautiful. I've seen it used as a teaching tool by professors, and it's such a great way to talk about history and talk about archives. Everything in that mural, you can point to an archival collection, which I think is really
How fun. Yeah, that's great. Okay, so just another plug. The exhibit is open until January 15th
Mhm.
at the Houston Heritage Society. The link to the exhibit information is here in the chat. So we hope that all of you can go and see it and see Mika's hard work. Thank you to all the folks at LULAC who helped usher this along. And thanks to the people at the Houston Heritage Society for making it happen in this space, which is a really nice space. So I do just want to say thank you, Mika, for being here with us tonight. We have another MACRI talk coming up in a couple of weeks. Now, this one is going to be an afternoon tardeada on Sunday, December the 3rd. We will have, and I'm sorry, let me take that caption down so you can see better. There we go. We're going to have Dr. Carlos Blanton visiting us at the MACRI Visitor Center here in San Antonio, but we'll also be live streaming it. So you can watch this from wherever you may be. He is going to be talking about Mexican-American civil rights trailblazer George I. Sanchez. And you can get more information about it on our website at somosmacri.org. That'll be the last MACRI talk of the calendar year, but we'll be back in January. So we hope you can join us. And also, just before we go, I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight and thank our funders. We can't do these things without our funders, including the City of San Antonio, Bexar County, AARP, Wells Fargo, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Texas Historical Foundation, the Summerlee Foundation, the San Antonio Area Foundation, and the John L. Santikos Fund. Thank you, funders. Also, individual donors. Thank you, individual donors. If you like tonight's presentation, I encourage you to learn more about MACRI at somosmacri.org. We regularly host talks like tonight's talk, and we're building the nation's first museum dedicated to Mexican-American civil rights history, and we need your support. Please visit our website to subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on social media. I hope we see you again soon. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you, Mika.
Thank you. Bye.